April 1917, 04:15 hours, London, England. A young woman's hands trembled as they gripped a telegram. The ink was smudged, the words barely legible. Yet in that fleeting moment, she understood the truth that many men on the front lines would never grasp. War was a machine, and women were its gears. She could already hear the clamour of factories, the endless assembly lines, the sharp metallic clang of machinery. The sound of war, not from a battlefield, but from the heart of the home front. The First World War, a brutal and relentless clash between empires, came to represent a reshaping of the world. But beneath the surface of war-torn landscapes and military triumphs lay a quieter revolution. Women, many of whom had never before left the domestic sphere, found themselves thrust into roles that defied every expectation. They were not just the caretakers and silent supporters behind the men in uniform. They were the ones who held society together while the world was shattered. In London, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coal, the echoes of distant sirens and muffled bombs. The streets, once bustling with idle chatter and laughter, now felt like a shadow of themselves, bare, desperate, and laden with uncertainty. The clattering of horse-drawn carts, the stomping of boots against cobblestones, and the distant hum of factory machines filled the air. But at the heart of this soundscape was a deeper silence, the silence of a woman's dilemma, the silence of an invisible army that would be called upon to fight a war not with rifles, but with raw, unacknowledged strength. As the war escalated, it quickly became clear that the military and industrial needs of the nation could not be met without the contributions of women. The call went out for women to fill the jobs left behind by the men who had gone to fight. But this wasn't simply a matter of stepping into existing roles. No, it was a reinvention, a complete overhaul of what it meant to be a woman in a society on the brink of destruction. They were asked to take up arms, figuratively and literally. Women worked tirelessly in munitions factories, producing weapons and ammunition that would be used in battles on foreign soil. They served as nurses, tending to the wounded under the most horrific of circumstances. Some even disguised themselves as men to enlist in the army, risking their lives in a fight that was not only against the enemy, but against the very system that sought to silence their contributions. This wasn't a British phenomenon alone. Women across Europe and beyond found themselves in positions they could never have imagined before. In France, Russia, and Germany, women took on similar roles, contributing to the war effort in ways that were unprecedented. They operated trains, repaired railroads, ran farms, and even worked as spies, gathering intelligence for the war machine. In the United States, the call for women to enter the workforce was equally urgent. Over 1.8 million women filled factory positions during World War I, creating munitions, vehicles, and supplies necessary for the Allied forces. The nation that had for so long confined women to the home now needed them to keep the wheels of war turning. The irony was profound. Women were not only expected to fill the gaps left by men, but they also became indispensable to the survival of their countries. Yet this was a paradox that would come to haunt them when the war ended. For many women, the reality of their newfound independence was both exhilarating and terrifying. At first, they reveled in the new sense of purpose they had found. No longer confined to the kitchen or hearth, they entered factories, hospitals, and offices with a sense of pride and determination. They were part of something larger, something that mattered. But the rewards were bittersweet. The work was grueling. 12-hour shifts, hazardous conditions, and the constant fear of air raids or bombs falling nearby. In the factories, women worked with dangerous chemicals and heavy machinery, risking injury or death every day. And despite the vital nature of their work, they were still treated as secondary citizens. Their contributions went largely unrecognized by the men returning home, eager to reclaim their places in the workforce. The most cruel irony lay in the fact that, despite their immense contribution to the war effort, Women were expected to return to their domestic roles once the war ended. When the soldiers came home, society returned to its old norms, pushing women back into the background. The war, which had given them power and purpose, took it all away. In a way, the war had not only reshaped the world, it had reshaped the roles of women, leaving them to confront a new reality of lost freedom. For the women who had worked in factories, served as nurses, or fought in secret, the end of the war was not a triumph, but a tragedy. They returned home to a world that had barely changed, and yet they themselves were forever altered. The scars they carried, physical, emotional, and psychological, were invisible to the world around them. No medals were awarded for their sacrifices. Their stories remained largely untold, lost in the haze of history. In the aftermath of the war, many women began to reflect on the toll it had taken on them. They had been asked to give everything. Yet when the war ended, they were told to return to lives of quiet submission. The war had altered their identity, reshaped their ambitions, and for some, destroyed their sense of self. But one thing was clear: they had fought a different kind of war, one that left a lasting legacy not in the trenches, but in the very fabric of society itself. April 1919, 1900 hours, London, England. The factory is silent now. The machines that once hummed with the intensity of wartime production are still. The women who once worked there, now largely forgotten, sit in the shadows of a new world that doesn't quite know what to do with them. As the men return from the front lines, they bring with them not just victory, but a call to silence the voices of those who kept the home front intact. What, then, is the true cost of war? In the heart of London's East End, the sound of clanking machinery echoed through the factory halls. A young woman, no older than 20, stood shoulder to shoulder with other women, each wearing the same faded blue overalls. Her fingers were stained with black soot, a reminder of the hours spent shaping the deadly shells that would soon tear through enemy lines. The rhythmic hum of the machines filled the air, but in her mind there was only silence, an unsettling quiet that came with the knowledge of what her work would cause. The woman paused for a moment, wiping sweat from her brow. She glanced at the factory floor, where hundreds of other women worked tirelessly, their eyes fixed on their tasks. Some whispered softly to each other, but most, like her, worked in near silence, lost in their own thoughts. What would happen to them once the war was over? Would they return to the home they once knew? Or would they be forced back into lives of subjugation, their newfound power slipping away with each passing day? When the war began in 1914, the British government faced a major problem. There weren't enough men to fill the factory jobs needed to supply the military with munitions, uniforms, and supplies. With millions of men off fighting, women were called upon to take up roles in factories that were once strictly reserved for men. By 1917, over 1 million women in Britain were employed in munitions factories. This was no small feat. These women were making bullets, shells, grenades, and other essential wartime materials. Their work was the lifeblood of the war effort, a contribution that was often overlooked and undervalued. The women who worked in these factories were often referred to as munitionettes, a term that conveyed both their essential role in the war and the condescension with which they were regarded. Despite being essential to the war's success, many of these women were paid far less than their male counterparts in similar jobs. Yet their labor was indispensable. Without them, the war could not have been won. Women's participation in the munitions industry wasn't confined to Britain. Across Europe and the United States, women took on similar roles, often in dangerous and grueling conditions. In France, over 1 million women worked in munitions factories, producing ammunition that would be used in one of the deadliest conflicts in history. In the United States, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking up factory positions and helping to supply the Allies with the materials they needed to win. The scale of this workforce shift was unprecedented. In Britain alone, women made up 50% of the munitions workforce by the end of the war. These women were responsible for manufacturing the very weapons that would be used to destroy entire cities. Yet they were rarely celebrated for their efforts. Instead, their work was viewed as temporary, a necessary evil to help win the war. Once the men returned, it was assumed that women would go back to their traditional roles in the home. But history would prove this assumption wrong. The war had changed the role of women in society forever. Their participation in the workforce during the war showed the world that women were just as capable of doing the jobs traditionally held by men. The irony, of course, was that these women's contributions would be forgotten in the post-war years, when they were once again pushed into domestic roles. The irony of the munitionettes' contributions lay not only in their essential role during the war, but in the way society chose to forget them after the war ended. These women were the backbone of the war effort, and yet once the war was over, their voices were silenced. The munitions factories closed, and the women were expected to return to the home, their newfound independence stripped away. The very society that had relied on them to win the war now rejected them. In many ways, these women were the unsung heroes of the war. They fought not with rifles, but with their hands. They worked long hours under hazardous conditions, and many of them suffered long-term health consequences from the exposure to dangerous chemicals and toxic fumes. Some even died from lead poisoning or explosions. Yet despite their sacrifices, they were often overlooked in the official histories of the war. Their contributions were relegated to the background, overshadowed by the glorification of the soldiers on the front lines. The factory floor was chaotic, a whirlwind of motion and sound as the women worked in unison, assembling munitions with a speed and precision that would rival any trained soldier. One woman, her face streaked with sweat and grime, worked feverishly to finish her shift. Her hands were raw, her fingers stiff from hours of work. But she didn't stop, she couldn't stop. The war was still raging and her work was needed. As she placed the final shell in the crate, she wiped her brow, exhaustion settling in. Her heart was heavy, not just from the physical strain, but from the knowledge that her efforts would likely go unnoticed. Just as she finished, the air around her seemed to still. A loud explosion from across the room shattered the calm, and for a moment everything seemed to slow. The factory floor was a blur of motion as the women scrambled to find safety. But for the woman who had been working tirelessly, the explosion was a reminder of what she was truly creating: destruction. She wasn't just making ammunition, she was making the tools of war, tools that would kill and maim. The weight of this truth hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been fighting her own war, one that would never be acknowledged. After the war ended, many of these women were sent home, their work deemed unnecessary now that the men had returned. The factories closed and the women returned to their homes. But they were not the same as they had been before. They had tasted independence, and the war had shown them a world in which they were capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. But the world around them had not changed. Some women continued to work in factories or take up other roles, but many were pushed back into the traditional roles of wife and mother. The progress made during the war was quickly undone, and many women were left to wonder, what had it all been for? The work of the munitions factory women, though essential to the war effort, was often swept under the rug. The recognition they deserved was never given, and their sacrifices were forgotten. The war had changed their lives, but the world had not yet caught up. April 1919. 1900 hours, London, England. The factory is silent now. The women who once worked there, creating the weapons of war, are gone. The machines, still as stone, are a reminder of the work they did. But the story of their contributions is buried beneath the rubble of history. The war may be over, But for them, the battle for recognition has only just begun. The battlefield was a grotesque scene of blood, smoke, and chaos. Amidst the screams of dying men and the sharp crackle of gunfire, a woman in a faded nurse's uniform bent over a soldier's broken body. Her hands, steady despite the surrounding madness, pressed a bandage against his wound, the fabric already soaked in red. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. Every day felt like the first, yet with each new casualty, she hardened herself, fighting not for victory or glory, but for survival. In the midst of the frenzy, she could hear the cries of others, men and women alike, calling out for help, for salvation. She couldn't save them all, but each one she saved felt like a small victory. Her life, like the lives of all the women who had come here, had been forever altered by the war. She had left behind the comfort of a life she knew for this endless cycle of suffering and relief, hope and despair. As the war raged on, the need for medical care on the front lines became insurmountable. Traditional medical staff were simply not enough. The scale of injury and death was beyond anything the world had seen before, and a new generation of women answered the call. They weren't soldiers, they weren't heroes in the traditional sense, but they were the lifeline for countless men on the battlefield. Over 100,000 women served as nurses and in other medical roles during the First World War. The voluntary aid detachments, VADs, which were composed primarily of women, played a critical role in providing medical care to soldiers. The British Red Cross, among other organizations, enlisted thousands of women to work in hospitals, field units, and even makeshift camps near the frontlines. These women weren't just helping with bandages and medications, they were involved in surgeries, evacuations, and rehabilitation, dealing with the aftermath of both the physical and psychological trauma that war inevitably brought. Their work took them to the most dangerous and horrific places on earth. Many of them served close to the front lines, treating the wounded as they were brought in, often under heavy artillery fire. The conditions were grim. Overcrowded hospitals, inadequate supplies, unsanitary conditions, and an endless stream of injuries that no one could have anticipated. Yet these women worked tirelessly, day after day, not for recognition, but for the simple hope of saving lives. The contribution of women in nursing during World War I wasn't limited to Britain. Women all across Europe and beyond took on similar roles, many of them leaving behind families and careers to serve in the war. In Germany, France, Russia, and the United States, women entered military hospitals, helped run ambulances, and volunteered for Red Cross and other relief efforts. In addition to nurses, many women also worked as clerks, telephone operators, and ambulance drivers, tasks that were vital to the war effort but often overlooked in the grand historical narrative. Their roles were not as glamorous or celebrated as those of the soldiers, but they were integral to maintaining the machinery of war. Without the support of these women, the medical infrastructure of the war would have collapsed under the strain. Women in nursing were also instrumental in the development of new medical practices and technologies. The war saw advancements in blood transfusions, amputations, and surgical techniques. Women working as nurses were often at the forefront of these innovations, learning new techniques on the fly and adapting to the ever-changing demands of the war. Their ability to improvise and innovate under pressure played a pivotal role in saving countless lives. The irony of the women who served as nurses during World War I was that while their work was essential to the war effort, it was often overlooked in favor of the stories of soldiers. While the soldiers were celebrated as heroes, the women who saved their lives were pushed to the background. The nurses didn't wear medals or receive the same level of recognition as the men who fought on the front lines. Their names were rarely remembered, their stories buried under the weight of military victory. What's more, despite the critical role that women played in wartime healthcare, their contributions were often relegated to the realm of women's work, a term that implied their efforts were secondary to those of men. They were not seen as soldiers or warriors, but as caregivers, a role that was deemed socially acceptable but not historically significant. This sentiment would persist long after the war ended, when many women who had served in the war were forced to return to the domestic sphere, their wartime careers dismissed as temporary. Yet despite the erasure of their efforts from the history books, the nurses and VADs who served during World War I were pioneers in their field. They not only revolutionized medical care, but also helped redefine what it meant to be a woman in the modern world. The war had shown them, and the world, that women were just as capable as men of taking on roles of immense responsibility and danger. In a makeshift hospital on the outskirts of the battlefield, a nurse bent over the body of a soldier who had been badly wounded. His breath was shallow, his eyes glazed with pain. She had been working non-stop for hours, but she didn't hesitate. She had seen death up close countless times, but each time it took a little more from her. She knew she couldn't save everyone, but she had to try. As she worked, a shell exploded outside the tent, sending debris flying. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the noise of the world outside seemed to fade. Inside, it was just her and the soldier, her hands steady as she worked, her heart racing as she performed surgery in the midst of chaos. She finished the operation, and the soldier's breathing steadied. She exhaled slowly, a brief flicker of relief washing over her. But as she stepped back, she saw the faces of the other women in the tent, nurses, doctors, and volunteers. All of them had the same tired, determined look in their eyes. They had been through this many times before, but they knew they had to keep going. The war was far from over, and their job wasn't finished yet. The war eventually came to an end, but for the women who had served, the aftermath was not one of celebration. The men returned home, heroes in the eyes of the nation, but the women who had saved their lives were left to return to their old lives, often without recognition or reward. Some went back to their families, others continued to work in healthcare, but many struggled to reconcile the life they had lived during the war with the roles society expected them to return to. Despite their invaluable contributions, the post-war years saw little effort to acknowledge the women who had served. They were not given the same status as their male counterparts, and many were forced to give up their work in favor of returning to traditional domestic roles. The war had shown women that they were capable of so much more, but society wasn't ready to accept this new reality. November 1918, 2300 hours, London, England. The hospital is quiet now, the sounds of the war fading into memory. The women who once worked tirelessly on the front lines return home, their faces etched with the toll of the war. They have saved lives, healed wounds, and witnessed unimaginable horrors. But they are not celebrated. The world is moving on, and yet they are still here, standing on the sidelines of history. What does it say about a society that glorifies war, but forgets the women who made victory possible? In the mud-soaked trenches of the Western Front, the sound of gunfire was constant, an unrelenting soundtrack to the chaos that surrounded her. She adjusted the collar of her uniform, pulling it tighter around her neck to shield herself from the biting cold. Her heart was racing, but she steadied her breath. No one knew who she was. No one could know. Beneath the heavy layers of clothing, the disguise was perfect. She had been trained to speak like a man, walk like a man, and most importantly, fight like a man. She'd come here not for glory, but for duty. She had fought for months, pretending to be something she was not, but her resolve never wavered. Each time she went over the top, each time she held a rifle, she did so with the knowledge that if anyone discovered her secret, her life would be over. But for now, she was just another soldier, and she would fight to the end. While the majority of women during World War I contributed from the home front, there was a small but significant number who took their place alongside the men at the front lines. Some, like the famous French spy Louise de Bettigny's, operated behind enemy lines, gathering critical intelligence for their countries. Others, like the women of the British Army's Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, disguised themselves as men to enlist and serve on the front. The decision to fight in the war was not taken lightly. Women who chose to take up arms were motivated by a sense of patriotism, a desire to prove themselves, and for some, an unshakable belief that they had the right to contribute just as men had. The women who joined the front lines weren't just soldiers, they were pioneers, rewriting the narrative of what it meant to be a woman in a world at war. These women faced extraordinary risks. They fought alongside men in some of the most brutal conditions imaginable, exposed to the horrors of trench warfare, constant bombardments, and chemical attacks. They were forced to navigate a world that did not want them there, constantly battling the dual challenge of fighting the enemy and concealing their true identities. Women on the front lines were a global phenomenon, though their roles varied from country to country. In Russia, women fought openly in the military as soldiers and officers. Maria Bochkareva, a Russian woman, famously led the Battalion of Death, a group of women soldiers who fought in some of the most intense battles of the Eastern Front. In Britain, the WAAC and other female military auxiliaries were not initially allowed to serve in combat roles, but they took on critical support functions in the trenches, often working as signallers, telephone operators, and even as cooks and clerks in close proximity to battle zones. In France, women not only acted as spies, but also as revolutionary agents, helping to carry messages and perform acts of sabotage against enemy forces. Their courage in carrying out these dangerous missions under constant threat of discovery demonstrated their unwavering commitment to their countries. Though most women did not see frontline combat in the traditional sense, their role in the war was no less significant. Many worked in medical units near the front, helping to treat the wounded soldiers who were brought in after the battles. In addition to those in uniform, thousands of women served as Red Cross nurses and VADs on the front lines. These women provided life-saving medical care under intense and dangerous conditions, often working in makeshift field hospitals just behind the front lines. The work was exhausting, and the emotional toll was high, but these women persisted, saving countless lives and bearing witness to the horrors of war. The women who fought on the front lines represented a paradox. They were soldiers, yes, but soldiers whose contributions were often overlooked or outright denied. While men were hailed as heroes for their bravery and valor, women soldiers were either ignored or their actions minimized. They were not seen as part of the official war narrative, even though their sacrifices were just as significant. The irony lies in the fact that many of these women fought for a world that still refused to accept them as equals. Even though their bravery and sacrifice were undeniable, women like Maria Bochkareva, who led the Battalion of Death in Russia, faced ridicule and scorn. For many women on the front lines, their gender disqualified them from the recognition they deserved. Their stories were pushed aside in favor of the glorification of male soldiers, and when the war ended, they were forced to return to their roles at home, just as they had been before. Yet their actions were transformative. These women had defied centuries of tradition. They had fought not only for their countries, but for the right to be seen and recognized as equal partners in the war effort. And in doing so, they set the stage for future generations of women to take on roles that were previously deemed impossible. The battle raged around her, a cacophony of screams and explosions filling the air. She crouched in a trench, rifle in hand, trying to steady her nerves. The dirt and blood caked into her uniform, but she didn't feel it. Her focus was solely on the task at hand, survival. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity, every breath a struggle to remain calm. As the enemy advanced, she and her comrades rose from the trench, charging forward with everything they had. The fear was palpable, yet she felt a strange calmness settle over her. This was it, the moment she had prepared for. She moved with precision, each step measured and deliberate. For once, she wasn't a woman in disguise. She was a soldier, and she was fighting for her life. After the battle, when the dust settled, she found herself standing in the midst of the wreckage, bloodied but alive. The men around her congratulated each other, celebrating their small victories. But there was no recognition for her. No one saw her as anything other than a soldier in a uniform, and yet, in that moment, she knew she had done something that would change her life forever, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. When the war ended, the women who had served on the front lines returned home, their roles erased from the official narrative of the war. They were not awarded the same recognition or status as the men who fought, and many were dismissed from their military roles entirely. For some, returning to civilian life was a bitter pill to swallow. They had fought with valor, yet they were once again expected to return to their traditional roles in the home. But for others, the war had been a moment of transformation. They had seen the world in a way that few women had, and it had changed them. Many would go on to challenge the gender norms that had kept them silent for so long. Their bravery, though overlooked at the time, laid the foundation for future generations of women to take on roles in the military and beyond. The real question, however, is whether society truly understood the significance of what these women had done. Did the world comprehend the magnitude of their bravery and the impact it had on the course of history, or were they simply forgotten, lost to the shadows of a war that had no place for them? November 1919, 1500 hours, London, England. The streets of London were filled with parades and celebrations, but for some women there was no grand return, no applause. They had fought for their country, side by side with men, but their sacrifices went unnoticed. As the world moved on, they quietly disappeared back into the folds of society, their stories relegated to the margins of history. What does it say about a world that celebrates war, but forgets the women who helped win it? On a bustling street corner in London, a young woman stood beneath the banner of the latest government propaganda poster. She was handing out flyers, urging men to enlist, urging families to support the war effort. The words on the paper were bold and patriotic, but she felt a hollow emptiness in her chest as she watched the men pass by, ignoring her calls. There was a part of her that believed in what she was doing, a part that wanted to be a part of something larger, but she couldn't help but wonder if this war would ever end, and if anyone would ever truly understand the sacrifices that had been made. She wasn't just handing out flyers, she was handing out hope. And yet in this moment, her own hope felt like a fragile, flickering thing. World War I is often remembered for its massive battles and the heroic actions of soldiers on the front lines, but the war's impact on civilian life was just as profound. On the home front, women played a pivotal role in keeping the nation running while the men were away fighting. They were not just workers in factories, but also the backbone of war propaganda campaigns and the driving force behind domestic organizations that provided aid to soldiers and their families. Propaganda was a powerful tool used by governments to mobilize support for the war. But behind these campaigns were the women who worked tirelessly to distribute propaganda, organize fundraising events, and encourage enlistment. They were part of a larger, invisible army that helped shape public opinion during the war, using words and images to inspire patriotism and rally citizens to the cause. In Britain, the iconic recruitment posters featuring Lord Kitchener Wants You were ubiquitous, but women played a critical role in getting these messages out to the public. They worked as volunteers for the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, the Red Cross and other organizations, helping to create and disseminate materials that would encourage men to enlist and support the war effort at home. Women's contributions in wartime propaganda were not confined to Britain alone. In the United States, women were encouraged to take part in the war effort by the Committee on Public Information, which was responsible for creating posters, films, and other materials designed to galvanize public support. Women were not only the audience for these campaigns, they were also the messengers. They helped organize rallies, sell war bonds, and even worked as journalists reporting on the war from the home front. In France, women took part in similar activities, spreading patriotic messages through the media and organizing volunteer efforts to support soldiers and their families. Many worked as nurses in the civilian hospitals, while others organized local communities to ration food and supplies, ensuring that the war effort could continue without interruption. These women often did so at great personal cost. They were exposed to the trauma of losing loved ones, living under the constant threat of air raids, and enduring the psychological toll of witnessing the war from a distance. Women in Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia also participated in the war effort in various ways, working both on the home front and in support roles near the front lines. They were tasked with organizing local communities, providing medical care, and working in factories to manufacture the weapons and supplies necessary for the war. Despite the challenges they faced, women across the world demonstrated remarkable resilience, often pushing through personal loss, societal restrictions, and the harsh realities of war to contribute to the overall effort. The most poignant irony in the role of women in wartime propaganda and civilian efforts was that, while they were essential to the success of the war, their contributions were rarely acknowledged in the aftermath. The men who returned from the front lines were hailed as heroes, celebrated for their bravery and sacrifice, while the women who had kept the home front intact were often forgotten or relegated to the background. These women were not seen as heroes in the traditional sense, despite their immense impact. Their work, though vital to the war effort, was often seen as secondary. It was classified as women's work, something that, while important, was not as glamorous or heroic as the work done by men in combat. The propaganda they helped create was designed to mobilize men, but it also painted women as passive participants, as motivators and supporters, rather than equal contributors. They were called upon to do their part, but after the war ended, society expected them to return to traditional domestic roles, erasing much of their wartime work from the official historical narrative. The bustling streets of London were filled with the constant noise of wartime activity, the rattle of carriages, the murmur of voices, the hurried footsteps of soldiers heading off to the front lines. In the midst of it all, a woman stood at the edge of a busy intersection, her arms laden with stacks of recruitment posters and flyers. She smiled politely at the men who passed by, urging them to enlist, to serve their country, to fight for their families. Her voice was steady, but beneath the surface, her thoughts churned. She had seen the toll the war had already taken on families, her own included. She had sent her brother off to fight, and now her husband was gone too. Every day she stood here, handing out these messages of hope and patriotism, but inside she wondered how many more lives would be lost. She had become the face of the war effort, but no one knew the cost it had exacted from her. Her own life was on hold, suspended in this endless limbo between duty and loss. She wasn't just handing out flyers. She was handing out pieces of her own heart, trying to believe that the war would end, and that all this sacrifice would somehow be worth it. After the war ended, many of these women returned to their homes, their roles as active participants in the war effort quickly forgotten. The men returned, heroes of the battlefield, but the women who had been integral to the war effort were sidelined. While the war had offered them an opportunity to step into roles of power and influence, the post-war world quickly tried to push them back into domestic life. The irony was clear. Society had asked these women to fill crucial roles during the war, yet after the fighting stopped, they were expected to return to their previous positions in the home. The work they had done, though essential to the success of the war, was dismissed as temporary. The propaganda they had worked on, which had been so vital to the nation's survival, was forgotten once the war was over. But the war had irrevocably changed these women. Their roles in wartime propaganda and civilian life had expanded their sense of self and their understanding of their own power. The world had seen what they were capable of, and even though society tried to push them back, these women had already tasted the freedom that came with their contributions. The war had changed them, and they would never go back to the way things were before. November 1919, 2000 hours, London, England. The city was quiet now, its streets lined with banners celebrating victory. But for the women who had worked tirelessly on the home front, there was no grand parade, no victory celebration. The work they had done was no longer remembered, their sacrifices erased from the pages of history. What does it say about a world that forgets the hands that held it together, that celebrates the soldiers but ignores the women who made their victory possible? The door creaked as she stepped into her home. The house was as she left it, quiet, orderly, the scent of old wood and lavender in the air. It should have felt like a comforting embrace, but instead it felt like a stranger's home. She looked around at the familiar furniture, the small clock ticking on the mantel, and wondered if she had ever truly belonged here. Her uniform, now discarded in the corner, seemed so out of place in this domestic world. She sighed and sat down at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the worn wood. There was a stack of letters in front of her, some unopened, others long since ignored. The world outside had moved on, but she was stuck in a strange limbo. The war had changed her, had given her a new sense of purpose, and now she had to give it all up. Her work, her independence, her voice, all of it was now expected to return to silence. Outside, the sounds of children playing echoed through the streets, the normalcy of life so stark in contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. She felt like an intruder in her own life, unsure of where to go or what to do next. What had it all been for? What did it mean to have fought for something, only to return to a life that no longer fit? When the war ended, there was a widespread push to return to normalcy. The men who had fought were hailed as heroes and were expected to reclaim their positions in the workforce. But for the women who had stepped into the roles left behind by these men, the end of the war meant a return to the domestic sphere, whether they were ready for it or not. Though many women had tasted a newfound sense of independence and purpose, society pushed them to relinquish these gains in favor of their traditional roles. Women who had worked in munitions factories, served as nurses, and fought on the front lines were told to return to their homes, their contributions dismissed as temporary. The war had proven that women were capable of much more than society had once believed, but when the fighting ceased, these advancements were erased. For some women, the transition back to domestic life was a struggle. They had tasted freedom, and now they were being asked to return to a life of subservience and silence. The world they had known before the war seemed almost alien to them now. The roles they were expected to return to, wife, mother, caretaker, felt stifling in comparison to the lives they had been living during the war. This return to traditional roles wasn't just an individual experience. It was part of a broader societal push to return to pre-war norms. Governments and social institutions sought to normalize the post-war world, and this included returning women to their homes. In Britain, the government encouraged women to leave their factory jobs and make way for returning soldiers. While some women were able to find new employment, many were forced to leave their jobs and return to domestic duties. In the United States, many women who had worked in wartime factories or served in auxiliary roles were encouraged to give up their positions so that men could return to the workforce. The same was true in France, where women who had taken up roles as ambulance drivers, munitions workers, and nurses were urged to step aside and allow the men to take their place. However, the post-war years saw a dramatic shift in the way women viewed their roles in society. The war had provided women with a sense of autonomy and purpose that they had never experienced before. The societal pressures to return to domesticity were immense, but they did not go unchallenged. Many women resisted the push to return to the home and fought for their right to remain in the workforce. Some fought for the right to continue their work in hospitals, factories, and other sectors, while others took to the streets to demand equality in the workplace and beyond. The greatest irony of the post-war years was that while women had been indispensable to the war effort, their contributions were often erased once the war ended. They had worked in factories, served as nurses, fought on the front lines, and kept society intact during the darkest days of the war. Yet when peace was restored, they were expected to step aside and return to lives of domesticity. The war had shown the world that women were capable of much more than society had previously believed, yet this progress was not allowed to stand. Instead, women were pushed back into the roles they had fought so hard to escape. The progress they had made during the war was seen as temporary, a necessary sacrifice for the war effort, but not a permanent change. The irony was that the war had given women the opportunity to prove their worth, but in the aftermath, society demanded that they return to their old roles, erasing the very progress they had fought to achieve. In the months following the war, a woman sat in her small home, staring out the window. She could see the men outside chatting and laughing, their lives seemingly unaffected by the war, but she felt as though she had been changed forever. Her uniform, now packed away in a box in the corner of her room, was a constant reminder of the work she had done. She had been a nurse, a munitions worker, a volunteer on the front lines, and now she was expected to return to a life that no longer felt like her own. The woman thought of the countless lives she had saved, the countless hours she had worked, and the fear she had overcome. She had been part of something larger, something that mattered. But now all of it seemed distant, as though it belonged to someone else. The doorbell rang, and the moment was broken. A neighbor stood at the door, holding a basket of food and a note of thanks for the work she had done during the war. She smiled politely, accepting the gift, but inside she couldn't shake the feeling that it was all meaningless. The world had moved on, and she had been left behind, her contributions to the war effort slipping into the shadows. For many women, the post-war years were marked by a profound sense of loss. They had been part of something significant, and now they were asked to return to lives that felt incomplete. The war had given them a glimpse of independence, of a life outside the home. But once the war was over, they were expected to return to domestic roles that seemed, in comparison, small and confining. The irony was not lost on these women. They had proven their worth, shown their capability, but in the end, society refused to recognize the significance of their contributions. The post-war world seemed to tell them that their work was only valuable when it was needed for the war effort. Once peace was restored, they were to return to their roles as wives and mothers, roles they had once willingly embraced, but now felt like a form of confinement. April 1920, 1000 hours, London, England. The house is quiet now, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. She sits at the table, her hands resting on the newspaper before her, but her mind is far away. The world outside has moved on, but she remains here, a silent witness to a change she has yet to fully comprehend. What does it say about a society that asks women to fight for it, but then tells them to return to silence when the fighting ends? An elderly woman sat in the corner of her living room, the faint glow of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. Her children and grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter filling the air, but she couldn't bring herself to join them. She had spent most of her youth in the midst of the war, rushing from one factory to another, serving as a nurse, giving everything she had to the cause. But now, in the twilight of her years, she wondered if it had all been for nothing. The medals, the certificates, the stories she had once told, they had all faded with time. She was a relic of a bygone era, a chapter of history that few cared to remember. Her hands, once steady as she tended to the wounded or worked long shifts in the factory, were now frail and weathered, the marks of time and sacrifice etched deep into her skin. She thought of the young women she had once worked alongside, the bonds they had shared, and the sacrifices they had made. She wondered if anyone would ever know what they had done, or if their story would be lost like so many others from the war. The war had ended over a decade ago, but for the women who had served, the battle was not over. While society had moved on, the legacies of these women, of their work in the factories, hospitals, and on the front lines, remained largely forgotten. For some, the return to domestic life had been a bitter pill to swallow. They had proven their worth, had shown the world that they were capable of so much more than anyone had believed, and yet, when the war ended, they were pushed back into the confines of their old roles. Some women found solace in their families, but for many there was a deep sense of loss. The independence they had tasted during the war was now gone. The work that had defined their lives was no longer needed, and they were expected to quietly fade back into the background, their contributions dismissed as temporary. Globally, the women of World War I left behind a legacy that was rarely acknowledged. Across Europe, the United States, and beyond, women had stepped into roles that had once been reserved for men. They had worked in factories, served as nurses, fought on the front lines, and contributed in ways that were vital to the war effort. Yet, in the aftermath, their stories were often erased from the official history of the war. The feminist movements that followed in the decades after World War I began to challenge the silence that surrounded these women's contributions. But despite these efforts, the full recognition of their roles remained elusive for many. The struggle for women's rights, equality in the workplace, and recognition in history continued, but the shadow of World War I loomed large, and the stories of the women who had fought and worked remained largely untold. The real tragedy of World War I for women was not just the toll it took on their bodies and minds, but the way in which their contributions were erased from history. They had fought for their countries, for their families, for a world that needed them. And yet when the war ended, their stories were forgotten. They were relegated to the sidelines, their sacrifices overshadowed by the glorification of the men who fought on the front lines. The irony, of course, was that these women had been the backbone of the war effort. They had carried the weight of the war on their shoulders, not with rifles or medals, but with sweat, blood, and tears. Yet their stories were silenced in the aftermath. The world moved on, but for these women, the memories of their contributions remained locked in the past, and their legacy was left to fade away. In the quiet of her home, the elderly woman sat by the window, gazing out at the changing seasons. She could hear the laughter of her grandchildren in the yard, but the world outside felt distant. Her thoughts were with the women she had known during the war, the ones who had stood beside her in the factories, the hospitals, and on the front lines. They had been the silent architects of the war's success, and yet their stories had been buried beneath the weight of history. She thought of the letters, the photos, the memories she had kept hidden away for so many years. They were the only things that connected her to that time, to the woman she had once been. But as the years passed, she realized that those memories would not be enough. No one would ever know the full extent of what they had done. No one would remember the sacrifices they had made. And yet she was determined to keep those memories alive, even if only in her own heart. She could not let the legacy of the women who had fought beside her be lost forever. In the years after the war, the contributions of women in World War I were gradually acknowledged, but it was a slow and difficult process. The societal pressures to return to normal were immense, and many women found themselves relegated to the background once again. Their stories, their sacrifices, and their courage were often buried beneath the male-dominated narrative of war. But for some, the legacy of their contributions was carried forward. The women who had fought for equality during the war would go on to become the leaders of the women's rights movements in the years to come. They would continue to fight for the recognition they deserved, for the right to be seen as equals in every sense. And while the world might not have fully understood the magnitude of their contributions in the aftermath of the war, their stories would live on through the generations of women who followed in their footsteps. April 1930, 0600 hours, London, England. The sun had risen, casting a soft light over the streets of London. The world was moving on, but for the women who had fought, who had worked, and who had sacrificed during the war, the story was far from over. Their legacy, though forgotten by many, lived on in the quiet corners of history, preserved in the hearts of those who had lived through it. And as the years passed, they would be remembered not as the forgotten women of war, but as the silent warriors who had shaped the world without ever receiving their due.